Have you ever noticed that the louder someone tries to be, the less power they seem to hold? You might give, show up, always be present, hoping that by being available you'll be valued. But instead, something subtle begins to shift. You stop being appreciated. You start being expected. Your presence fades into the background, not because you're less, but because you're too often. And here's the hard truth. The more you chase attention, the more it runs from you. We live in an age where being visible is confused with being important, where showing up is confused with being needed. But Machiavelli understood something that most still miss. He warned that constant presence makes a man ordinary. And the Stoics, those quiet architects of inner strength, agreed. They didn't show up for applause. They showed up when it mattered. Because true power doesn't chase attention, it commands presence. Think about it. The people who move you the most, the ones whose words carry gravity, whose silence makes you pause, they're not always around. They don't speak just to be heard. They don't enter every room just to be seen. Their restraint builds reverence. Their absence creates value. Their timing is precise. Their power is deliberate. This isn't about hiding. It's not about being aloof or unreachable. It's about choosing when you show up and why. And in a world addicted to noise, that choice becomes revolutionary. Maybe you felt the need to respond quickly. Maybe you've posted something not because you had something meaningful to say, but because silence felt like being forgotten. Maybe you've said yes when you meant no, just to stay relevant, to stay included. But let me ask you this. What if the most powerful version of you is the one that doesn't seek to be seen, but chooses to be felt? In this video, we'll explore the quiet strength of those who don't chase attention, the emperors, the warriors, the thinkers, and how their power came not from being everywhere, but from being missed. From showing up with clarity, not out of compulsion, from stepping back, not to disappear, but to rise. Because the man who is always seen becomes familiar. And the one who appears with intention, he becomes unforgettable. Part 1. The Paradox of Attention. You've been told that to matter, you need to be seen. That if you want respect, recognition, or love, you need to show up, speak often, and never let anyone forget you. But slowly, almost without warning, you begin to feel something shift. You're always available, always saying yes. You answer every message, you never miss a moment, and yet you feel invisible. Not because you've disappeared, but because you've been too present. That's the paradox of attention. The more you give it, the less you're noticed. There's a reason why the rarest things in life are often the most valuable. Not because they are louder, but because they are scarce. Reserved. They carry weight, not because of volume, but because of timing. Niccolo Machiavelli once warned, a man who is always present becomes ordinary, vulnerable, predictable. He knew that too much exposure doesn't amplify power, it dissolves it. When people see you all the time, they stop looking for you. When they hear your voice constantly, they stop listening. And when your presence becomes routine, it loses its meaning. It's not your fault. You were raised in a world that confuses noise with impact, where constant posting, reacting, responding is seen as commitment, where absence is mistaken for weakness. But the Stoics taught something deeper, something quieter. Presence isn't about frequency, it's about intention. It's not how often you appear, it's how grounded you are when you do. Epictetus said, "If you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Because the pursuit of being liked, being seen, being understood by everyone, that's not freedom, that's dependence. And the Stoic path has never been about chasing validation. It's about standing firm in your own clarity, even if the world doesn't notice. Imagine this. You walk into a room where you haven't been in weeks. You've been silent, focused, doing the inner work. No announcements, no grand gestures. Just stillness, and yet heads turn. People look up. Your presence says more than your words ever could. Why? Because they haven't seen you in a while. Because they wonder what you've been building. Because absence sharpens perception. Scarcity creates gravity. There's a scene from history. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. His entire court revolved around him, yet he was rarely seen. His presence was choreographed, ritualized, and because of that, every glimpse of him felt like witnessing something divine. He understood what Machiavelli warned and what the Stoics lived. Power is preserved, not in exposure, but in restraint. And what about your own life? Have you ever noticed how the friend who's always there gets overlooked? Their loyalty becomes expected. Their kindness fades into the background. But the one who's quiet, the one who appears only when it matters, they're the one who leaves an impression. This isn't about manipulation. It's not about withholding yourself out of fear or pride. It's about protecting what's sacred, your energy, your time, your presence. When you give too much of yourself, not because it's right, but because you're afraid of being forgotten, you begin to dissolve. You lose your edge. You lose the mystery that invites others to lean in, to wonder, to value. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Everything we do should be done as if it were the last act of our life. That includes when we speak, when we show up, and yes, when we choose not to." So if you're feeling unseen right now, if you're wondering why your presence doesn't carry the weight it once did, maybe it's not because you're not enough. Maybe it's because you're giving too much. Step back. Let the silence speak. Let your absence create space, because what's rare becomes remembered. What's always there becomes forgotten. You are not meant to be part of the background. You are meant to move with precision, with clarity, with restraint. Don't chase attention. Let your stillness become a question that lingers in the minds of others. Let your presence be felt, not because it's constant, but because it's chosen. Part 2. Strategic absence is not hiding. You don't need to vanish to be respected. But you do need to stop showing up just to be seen. There is a difference, a deep one, between withdrawing in fear and stepping back with purpose. One is hiding. The other is choosing, and in a world that's always reaching, always broadcasting, always explaining, your restraint becomes a quiet rebellion. Strategic absence is not avoidance. It is alignment. It's learning to show up not when others demand it, but when the moment calls for presence. It's about becoming deliberate with your time, intentional with your energy, and unapologetic with your silence. Seneca once wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you. Welcome those whom you are capable of improving. The process is mutual. Men learn as they teach." Now ask yourself this: if your time is constantly being pulled in every direction, how much of it actually improves you? How much of it deepens your life? When you remove yourself from noise, not forever but purposefully, you begin to hear your own thoughts again. You begin to remember what matters. And you become stronger, not weaker. This is not about arrogance. This is about clarity. Because when you step back, the world doesn't forget you. It remembers you differently, not as someone who's always around, but as someone whose presence must be earned. Think about nature. The moon doesn't shine every night in full, yet when it does, it moves oceans. It silences crowds. Its power is in the rhythm of return, not the pressure of constant light. You, too, have that right. To not be accessible on demand. To not answer every call. To not offer explanations for every step you take. That's not retreat. That's sovereignty. You're not here to convince others of your worth through attendance. You're here to cultivate a presence so clear, so rooted, that even your silence holds weight. And the paradox is, the less you show up out of obligation, the more powerful you feel when you do arrive. Because your presence is no longer reactive, it's a choice, and choices carry energy. Boundaries generate gravity. The Stoics understood this long before the world became addicted to attention. Marcus Aurelius, burdened with the weight of an empire, still wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one. Notice the shift. Don't talk, don't justify, don't prove, just be. Just live the standard you wish to uphold, quietly and fully." And that's what strategic absence gives you. Space to live the life that doesn't need constant justification. Let me tell you a story. There was once a man who said yes to everything. Every request, every invitation, every phone call. He feared that by saying no, he would lose connection. But in time, people stopped listening when he spoke. Not because he lacked value, but because his presence was always guaranteed. It became routine, expected, and eventually invisible. Then one day he said no. He pulled back. He took time. He gave silence where he once gave explanation, and something changed, not outside, but inside. He felt calm again. His voice steadied. His thoughts deepened. And when he returned to the room, people listened differently. That man could be you. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You don't need to be seen to be valuable. What you need is to stop living at the mercy of urgency and start choosing moments of meaningful presence. Strategic absence is not about being less of yourself. It's about offering the most grounded version of yourself on your own terms. So when you feel the pull to answer every message, pause. When you feel the fear of missing out, breathe. When you feel the pressure to always show up, step back and ask, am I doing this from strength or from fear? Because when your absence is intentional, it becomes powerful. And when your return is chosen, it becomes unforgettable. You are not hiding. You are recentering. And in that quiet space, away from the noise, you remember who you are. And when you remember who you are, the world starts remembering too. Part 3. Presence as a currency. You've probably been told your time is valuable, but there's something even more powerful: your presence. Your presence isn't just you being somewhere. It's not simply showing up physically or replying instantly or being the one who's always there. It's the energy you bring, the weight you carry, the clarity behind your arrival. And like any currency, the more you spend it without intention, the less it's worth. Presence is power, but only when it's rare and when it's real. When you're constantly available, always responding, always reacting, you unintentionally teach others that your presence doesn't cost anything. And when something costs nothing, it begins to feel like nothing. But you're not nothing. You carry weight, and that weight increases the moment you stop giving yourself away without discernment. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Do not waste what remains of your life in speculating about others. Instead, be occupied only with what is in your control." What's in your control is where you go, why you go, and how you show up. And that includes your energy, your silence, your boundaries, because every time you offer your presence, you are spending something sacred. You don't owe everyone access to you. Not every situation deserves a reaction. Not every invitation deserves a yes. And not every message deserves a reply right away. This isn't rudeness, it's discipline. The discipline to move from reaction to intention. Think of it like this. Imagine walking into a room where someone you deeply admire is sitting quietly. They haven't said a word. but the room feels different. Why? Because they aren't trying to fill space. They don't need to be noticed. They carry themselves with a stillness that commands attention, not because they speak, but because they know when not to. That is presence. Now think of someone who talks just to talk, who shows up everywhere, who always has something to prove. Eventually, you stop listening. Their presence becomes noise, not because they don't matter, but because they've diluted their own weight. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote that a ruler who is always seen becomes common. Familiarity weakens authority, and the one who appears with intention, not desperation, holds the throne, even in silence. In today's world, you're pushed to be visible, to stay online, to remain reachable. But that's not presence, that's performance. Real presence doesn't need an audience. It needs alignment. So what does that mean for you? It means you choose your spaces. You protect your energy. You learn the quiet skill of showing up with clarity, not compulsion. You don't speak to be heard. You speak when your words carry weights. You don't attend just to be seen. You attend when your presence adds meaning, and that's how your presence becomes a currency. It doesn't lose value when you step back. It gains power because people start to notice the difference between when you're there and when you're not. Here's the truth you've been waiting for. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who walk into a room with the kind of energy that can't be faked, not loud, not overbearing. Just steady, present, intentional. And you can be that person, but only when you stop giving away the most powerful part of you, your presence, without reflection. Seneca reminds us, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Don't waste yourself on moments that don't deserve you. Don't spend your presence in places where it's only absorbed, not appreciated. Instead, treat it like the rare and precious force that it is. Show up rarely, but show up powerfully, because when you start holding your presence like currency, the world responds, not with attention, but with respect. Not with noise, but with silence, the kind of silence that listens, that leans in, that remembers, and in that space you stop chasing value, you become it. Part 4, Case Studies in Silent Power. There's a kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up in constant motion or loud declarations. It moves quietly, but with intention. And when it arrives, it changes the entire atmosphere. You felt it before, in someone who walks into a room and says nothing, yet somehow shifts the air. Not because they demand attention, but because their silence speaks more than noise ever could. True power doesn't need to prove itself. It simply is. To understand this deeply, let's turn to history, because some of the most powerful people the world has ever known weren't the loudest. They weren't always visible, but they were unforgettable. Louis XIV, the king who mastered distance. Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, understood presence in a way few leaders ever have. He ruled not just through law or wealth, but through mystique. He choreographed his life like a ritual. Even his daily waking and meals were performances. And yet access to him was rare. It wasn't a coincidence. It was strategy. By limiting how often he was seen, he became larger than life. His silence was studied. His glances were interpreted. A single nod could change someone's fate because it came from a man who rarely gave them. And you don't need a palace to create distance that builds respect. You need the courage to step back, to stop showing up just because you feel expected to let your presence become something people anticipate, not something they assume. Subutai, the general who haunted without being seen. Then there's Subutai, the legendary Mongol general He didn't just win battles, he became a ghost on the battlefield. Armies would gather to face him, but he was never there. He vanished into mountains, deserts, whispers, and just when his enemies began to relax, he struck. Suddenly, precisely, unforgivingly. His power wasn't just in his tactics, it was in his ability to disappear, to allow fear, curiosity, and tension to build in his absence. Your silence can do the same, not to manipulate, but to create space, so that when you speak, when you act, it means something. Modern icons, the power of rare presence. Now let's bring it closer to our time. Beyoncé. Elon Musk. Two very different people, but with something in common. They don't oversaturate the world with their presence. Beyoncé doesn't flood social media. She doesn't give constant interviews. She disappears into creative silence, into intention. And then one day, an album drops. No warning, no noise, just impact. And the world listens. Why? Because she chose her moment. Because she didn't beg to be heard. She prepared. She aligned. She appeared. Elon Musk can vanish from public view for weeks, but when he speaks, markets move. Conversations erupt. It's not because of constant visibility. It's because his silence isn't passive. It's part of the message. And you? You don't need millions of followers to practice the same principle. You only need clarity. You need to know when to step back, when to let your work, your stillness, your growth mature in private. So that when you return, it's not with noise, but with meaning. Stoic roots. Why restraint builds reverence. This isn't just a modern concept, it's deeply rooted in Stoic philosophy. Epictetus said, "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." And the same is true for how others perceive you. If you are always visible, always present, people stop learning you, they stop discovering. They stop wondering, and wonder is where reverence lives. Silence gives space for reflection. For others to ask, where is he? What is he building? That's not arrogance, that's strength. That's emotional discipline. Your life, your stage. You may not be a general, a king, a global artist, but your life is still your stage, and how you show up, when you speak, when you stay quiet, shapes the way others see you. You don't need to chase eyes, you need to hold presence. Let your moments be intentional. Let your silence breathe, because when you learn from those who move the world without needing to constantly be in it, you begin to understand something timeless. You don't need to be everywhere to be powerful. You just need to be where it matters, when it matters, fully, calmly, and without apology. Part 5. Psychology of Absence. There's something about distance that stirs the soul. When someone is always present, always talking, always posting, you stop noticing. Not because they aren't valuable, but because your mind has already filed them under familiar, and what's familiar tends to fade. But take that same person and pull them back. Let them disappear, just enough for their absence to be felt. Suddenly their silence becomes a presence of its own. A question mark that lingers, a space that invites meaning, a pause that gains weight. Absence doesn't erase you, it reveals you. Modern psychology has a name for this. It's called the scarcity principle, made famous by Dr. Robert Cialdini. We don't just assign value to what is good, we assign value to what is rare. The less accessible something is, the more the human mind perceives it as meaningful. And this applies not just to things, but to people. That includes you. If you're always available, always answering immediately, always saying yes, you may not realize it, but your presence becomes expected, not appreciated, taken for granted, not treasured. But when you begin to hold yourself back, not in coldness, but in clarity, something changes. You stop being routine. You start being remembered. Seneca once wrote, "Nothing is more honorable than a grateful heart. But how can others be grateful for you if they've never had to miss you?" Absence invites appreciation. Distance sharpens value. And silence. Silence gives space for reflection. Think about someone who used to be in your life daily, maybe a mentor, a friend, a grandparent. You didn't notice every word they said when they were always there. But now, after they've stepped away or passed on, you remember one line, one glance, one moment. And it carries more weight now than it ever did back then. That's not nostalgia. That's psychology. That's the mind recalibrating value through absence. The Stoics understood this long before behavioral science did. Marcus Aurelius, a man surrounded by noise, war, and duty, still wrote to himself in silence. He knew that true clarity doesn't come from constant connection. It comes from stepping away, from the crowds, from the demands, even from yourself. In Meditations, he writes, "Withdraw into yourself, especially when you are forced to be in a crowd. It is in your own soul that you find refuge." Now here's the truth most people avoid. You don't become more loved by being more present. You become more appreciated by being missed. You don't grow your impact by flooding the room. You grow it by choosing your moments, by letting people feel your absence long enough to remember what it feels like when you're near. This isn't manipulation, it's maturity. You're not playing games. You're giving space for the truth to breathe. You're allowing relationships, conversations, and presence to carry meaning, not just motion. Because when you always respond instantly, always show up first, always say yes, you remove the tension. And it's intention that desire forms. It's in the pause that impact lives. Even in nature, absence gives beauty its depth. If the sun never set, would you notice its rise? If autumn never left, would spring feel like renewal? It's the space in between that makes the moment matter. So if you've ever felt unappreciated, if you've ever wondered why your presence doesn't hold the gravity you wish it did, ask yourself not what you're doing wrong, but what you're giving too freely. Your time, your energy, your voice, they are sacred, and what's sacred should never be overused. Create space. Let others lean in. Let them wonder. Let them wait, because in that space something ancient awakens, curiosity, and where curiosity lives, reverence begins. Let absence be part of your presence. Let silence carry your message before your words do. And let distance, when chosen wisely, become the most powerful force in the room. You don't lose value when you step back. You become priceless. Part 6. You don't need to prove your worth. How much of your life has been spent trying to prove that you matter? Think about it. How many times have you said yes when your body whispered no, just to be liked? How often have you spoken not because you had something to say, but because silence made you feel invisible? How often have you explained, justified, or over-clarified, not because it was needed, but because deep down you were afraid of being misunderstood? But here's the truth. You don't need to prove your worth. You just need to remember it. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes when you no longer feel the need to be validated by everything around you. And that's the kind of strength the Stoics built their lives upon. Epictetus said, "If someone tried to hand you a dead fish, you wouldn't accept it. So why accept the judgment of others, especially when it stinks?" What he's saying is simple, but profound. You don't have to carry opinions that aren't rooted in truth. You don't have to live your life reacting to how others see you or how you think they see you. You are allowed to hold your worth quietly, confidently, without broadcast, Because the most powerful people don't need to be loud about it, they just live it. And people feel it. When you're constantly available, constantly seeking approval, constantly proving, you're sending a message to yourself that you don't yet believe you're enough, but you are. And you always have been. Worth isn't something you earn, it's something you remember. You were not born to be everyone's answer. You were not born to explain your every step. You were not born to fix what others misunderstand. You were born to live with depth, with integrity, with presence. And none of those things require you to beg for attention. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injustice." Let that settle. You don't prove yourself by reacting. You prove yourself by remaining aligned with your values, your clarity, and your peace, even when someone doubts you, even when someone mocks your silence, even when you're left out, overlooked, misunderstood. Because real presence doesn't chase validation. It creates respect through restraint. Think about the strongest people you've known. They weren't always the loudest. They weren't always the first to speak. But when they did speak, it mattered. And when they walked into the room, you could feel the air change, not because they tried to impress anyone, but because they had nothing to prove. What would your life look like if you let go of the need to be constantly seen? What if you let silence do the work? What if you allowed your boundaries to speak before your words did? What if you trusted that your presence, when grounded, when honest, when whole, didn't need to be performed? This is what the Stoic path offers you. Not an escape from life, but a return to center, a return to the version of you that doesn't need applause to stay standing. So take a breath. Take a step back. Let go of the pressure to show up for everyone, all the time. You don't need to react to every misunderstanding. You don't need to post every thought. You don't need to say yes to every ask. You need to listen to yourself, to what feels aligned, to what feels strong, to what feels like truth. And when you begin to live from that space, not out of fear, but from clarity, you stop chasing worth. You start embodying it. The quiet man who knows who he is doesn't prove, he just is. And when you become that man or that woman, the world begins to see you differently. Not because you raised your voice, but because you raised your standard. And that's the kind of presence no one forgets. Part 7. The Ruler Who Returns Too Soon. There's a lesson hidden in history, one that speaks quietly but cuts deep. A lesson about timing, about presence, about what happens when you don't give your absence enough time to ripen into reverence. It's the story of a man who conquered empires, who was once feared, followed, and worshipped, but who came back before the world was ready to miss him, and in doing so, lost the very myth that once made him untouchable. That man was Napoleon Bonaparte. After his first exile to the island of Elba, Napoleon returned to France with fire. He rode in on memory, on legend, on momentum. For a brief moment, the people rallied. The military followed, and Europe held its breath. But his second reign, what history calls the 100 Days, collapsed far faster than the myth that built him. Not because he was weak, not because he lacked brilliance, but because he returned too soon. The distance between his presence and his myth was never given space to grow. The silence was too short. The memory was still too raw. And instead of admiration, what rose in the minds of people was familiarity. They remembered his flaws, his ambition, his humanity, and the myth turned back into a man. You've likely felt this in your own life. You leave a group, a relationship, a role, thinking space will bring clarity, but something inside you panics. You return too quickly. You send that message, show up at that gathering, reinsert yourself out of fear of being forgotten. But in doing so, you interrupt your own power. You don't give absence the time it needs to turn into significance. Machiavelli would have warned against this. He believed that a ruler must be seen sparingly, but with weight. Too much exposure makes you common. Too little presence makes you irrelevant. But the sweet spot, that delicate, powerful line, is where mystery becomes memory, and memory becomes reverence. You don't need to disappear forever, but you do need to step back long enough to let your absence mean something. Because it's in that space, when others feel your absence and are forced to reflect on what you once brought, that your worth begins to take deeper root. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly." He wasn't talking about death. He was talking about perspective. About what shifts inside you when you stop trying to force every moment and instead let time do its work. So what does that mean for you? It means being bold enough to step away without a guarantee. It means letting go of the urge to reappear just to be seen. It means trusting that what is real, what is rooted, doesn't need to be reminded constantly to stay alive. Power doesn't bloom from presence. It blooms from meaning, and meaning needs space. There's a story told in whispers, not headlines. The quiet leader, the distant teacher, the friend who stepped away, not in bitterness, but in calm. And when they returned, stronger, clearer, more grounded, the world noticed, not because they were loud, but because the silence they left behind still echoed. That can be you. You can return on your own terms, not to prove, but to lead. Not to remind, but to reignite. Not to chase attention, but to carry presence. But first, you must resist the fear that rises in silence. You must learn to sit with it, let it shape you, sharpen you. Because when you return too soon, you steal from yourself the very reverence your absence could have created. So take your time, let your distance speak. Let your silence settle, and when you return, return with gravity, not because they forgot you, but because they remembered what it felt like to have you near. That's not ego, that's wisdom. That's timing, that's power. And it's the kind of power that no one can take from you because it was never performed. It was earned, quietly, patiently, intentionally. Part 8, the modern Stoic path of presence. There's a kind of presence the world doesn't teach you. It doesn't sell it. It doesn't reward it with applause. Because this kind of presence isn't loud, doesn't demand, and doesn't need a spotlight. It's quiet, intentional, and deeply powerful. This is the path of the modern Stoic. Not someone who hides, but someone who knows when to appear, and more importantly, why. In a world that moves fast and speaks loud, your calm becomes your edge. You don't need to respond to everything. You don't need to be first to speak. You don't need to show up to prove you're alive. What you need is to choose your moments, not based on fear, not on pressure, but on clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. It stands unmoved and the raging of the sea falls still around it." That's what real presence is. It's not being everywhere. It's being grounded when you choose to stand. It's not about being known by many, but being unshakable within yourself. You live in an age where presence is confused with performance. Everyone wants to be visible. Everyone wants to be known. But the Stoic in you knows, being seen means nothing if you've lost your center. Your presence begins within. Not on a screen, not in a room full of people, but in your ability to stay true, to not react, to not chase, to not explain, when silence is more aligned with your values. Being a modern Stoic doesn't mean you disappear. It means you appear with meaning. It means you let go of the need to always participate in the noise. You stop rushing into conversations that drain you. You stop offering pieces of yourself to anyone who asks, because you've learned your attention is sacred. And what is sacred should not be spent carelessly. Seneca once wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." This presence, the kind that feels rare, that others respect even in silence, is learned. It's practiced. It's chosen, moment by moment. You don't have to explain your quiet. You don't have to justify your distance. You only need to live with the kind of focus that reminds people you are not absent. You are present in the deepest, most intentional sense of the word. Let your presence be like a lighthouse, still, steady, and only visible when needed. Not flashing for attention, but standing where it's built to be. So when the storm comes, those who truly matter will look to you, not because you were loud, but because you were clear. The modern Stoic lives by fewer words, but deeper truths. You stop chasing relevance, you start embodying substance, and slowly, people begin to notice. Not all of them, not instantly, but the right ones. The ones who feel your weight when you speak, who sense the thought behind your pauses, who trust the stillness in your presence more than the noise in others' performance. That's real influence, not having followers, but carrying a calm so deep it becomes a quiet force. So the next time you feel the need to show up, to prove something, to post, to reply, pause. Ask yourself, am I showing up with purpose or out of fear? Because how you answer that is your practice. That's the path. And that path, walked with integrity, walked with intention, that is what makes you unforgettable. Not the noise you made, but the meaning you carried. Not how many people saw you, but how many felt you. And that, my friend, is presence, the Stoic way. Conclusion: you don't need to be everywhere to be remembered. You don't need to shout to be heard. And you don't need to chase attention to prove your worth. When you live with restraint, when your silence is intentional and your presence is rare but rooted, you don't just walk through the world, you leave something behind. A quiet gravity, a calm strength, a presence that others feel even when you're not in the room. That is the path of the Stoic, and it's already within you. If this message stirred something in you, if you feel the pull to live with more clarity, more purpose, and less noise, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to the Stoic Philosophy, not for content, but for reminders of who you are when the world isn't watching, of the power you carry when you stop performing and start becoming. And if you're ready to walk this path, leave a comment below. I choose presence over performance, because in the end, you don't become unforgettable by being loud. You become unforgettable by being real. And real presence is rare, and rare is powerful.